Welcome, everyone, to the Association for Social Economics webinar podcast series. Throughout this series, we will explore the profound and multifaceted impact of economics. This podcast series is sponsored by the ASE, whose mission is to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and the broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. Each month, I get a chance to sit down and interview scholars in the field. I'm your host, Iris Booter, and with me today, I have Dr. Jacki Strenio, Assistant Professor of Economics at Norwich University. Jacki's research and teaching interests are in feminist economics, health, public policy, and pedagogy. Her current research focuses on violence against women and girls. She earned her MS and PhD in economics from the University of Utah and a BA in economics from the University of Colorado Boulder. She holds a higher education teaching specialist designation and is committed to implementing more effective research practices in her classrooms and encouraging diversity in economics education more broadly. Thanks, Jacki, for being with us today. Can you tell us a little more about yourself, your background, and what motivated you to get into the field of economics?
Sure. Hi, Iris. Thanks for the great introduction. And thanks to you and the Association for Social Economics for inviting me to talk to you all today. So I actually didn't know what economics was until I took my first economics class in college, a Principles of Microeconomics course. But since then, I've been hooked. I think economics is such an important way to understand how the world works. And I really believe that every question, issue, or topic that someone could be interested in has an economic dimension to it. But since that first economic class, my definition of economics has also expanded. I think the entry point to economics for many of us, like I know you and I and many other folks, is thinking about economics as the study of scarcity, or economics as a particular way of thinking, for example, thinking on the margin. Well, I think these are all components of economics. In the discipline, I now prefer to introduce and define economics as the study of social provisioning. So as an economist, and specifically a feminist economist, I'm interested in how individuals interact with one another and with their environments to get what we need to survive and thrive. So sure, some of that, like surviving and thriving, happens via individuals engaging in utility maximizing behavior in market, in like the market sphere. But a lot of that also happens in families and in friend groups, through caring and reciprocity, through unpaid work. So these are also really vital components for economists to study. And I think social provisioning acknowledges that approach to economics. And that also that human behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum, but instead it's conditioned by social norms and power structures, for example. So that trajectory, or that growth in terms of my understanding of what economics is and what economists study, has also led me to social economics, but also feminist economics. And a social provisioning approach is really popular among feminist economists for just that reason. Marilyn Power published a really classic piece in 2004 in the journal Feminist Economics. And she spends a lot more time like thoughtfully articulating these 5 components of social provisioning. Some of what I've already mentioned in my definition of economics, that is the need to incorporate caring and unpaid labor, thinking about economic success using well-being measures rather than just like resource-based measures, talking about power hierarchies and processes, thinking about ethical goals and values, and analyzing differences based on identities such as gender, race, and ethnicity. So, like as you've probably heard, this already sounds a lot like social economics as well, which emphasizes, as you mentioned, that economic behavior results from social interactions and has ethical consequences. So I think that's a really natural fit for me as well.
Love that. So I know that you've held several roles in the Association for Social Economics, including member of the Communications Committee, a regional representative, and now currently ombudsperson. So could you discuss how you got involved with the ASE and what these roles entail?
Sure. So in graduate school, Dr. Stephen Pressman, who's deeply involved in the organization, reached out to me because he wanted to incorporate more graduate students and early career scholars in the association. And he wanted to see if I would be willing to serve on what was then called the Membership and Outreach Committee. Um, I didn't really know what I was getting into, but the committee wasn't too active and the service burden wasn't too large. Our group mostly just served as like a sounding board for different membership outreach initiatives. We also experimented, funnily enough, with an early version of an ASE podcast as well. So thinking about ways in which the association could reach out to new members and specifically graduate students. So that was my first entry point into ASE, but I really believe in the association's objectives to promote research related to economics and ethics or social philosophy or human dignity. So I was interested in continuing to serve in some capacity with the Association for Social Economics. And so I ran for a regional representative or director position. And essentially, regional reps, at least through the ASE, have the responsibility of organizing more localized events for their specific like physical region, like geographic region. So what I did, I primarily organized ASE sponsored sessions at regional conferences. I sent out a call for papers and then submitted them and worked with that specific conference. This was when I was living in Oregon, so I primarily organized ASE sponsored sessions for the Western Economic Association International Conference every year. And the ASE gave us a small budget, and I used that to help fund graduate student travel to the conference. Those are both really great ways to get involved with the organization, and I can talk a little bit more about that as well if you'd like. I just started my 1-year term as ASE Buds person, so I don't have a lot to report yet, but I can talk a little bit about the responsibilities of that role. I am tasked with working with ASE leaders and members to investigate and help resolve any kind of conflicts that arise within the organization or like at the leadership level, at the membership level, or amongst folks submitting to the 2 ASE journals, and help to resolve whatever conflicts, issues, or concerns are brought up. The goal is also to kind of pay attention to any kind of systematic concerns that are arising over time and bring those to the attention of leadership. Ultimately, like hoping to make sure like all parties involved in any of these conflicts or concerns are able to find some kind of resolution.
Got it. I feel like what you said about, getting involved and not knowing what you got yourself into resonates so well with a lot of us.
Yeah.
And both, any organization and just well in academia in general, right?
Yeah.
So how can others interested in the ASE get involved? I know you mentioned it a little bit, but what advice do you have for others?
Yeah, there's so many ways to get involved. The first, I guess I would say, is just to join or renew your membership in the organization. That's just at socialeconomics.org. So that's one way to be in touch with what's going on at the organizational level. You can also submit research and papers to our conference sessions or to the 2 ASE journals. But if you'd like to be involved more behind the scenes, get involved in some service work, which I will say is a great way to get to know folks in like involved in research and social economics, but also involved in the economics discipline more broadly. Like for me, I'm at a smaller university, so this is a great way to expand my network of like other folks interested in interesting economic questions and research. You can reach out to me or anyone on the executive council and volunteer to serve on a committee. There's always work to be done if people are willing to do that. If you'd like to get involved in other ways, I'm sure you can also reach out to journal editors and volunteer to serve as a reviewer for one of the 2 journals, or just get your name on their radar.
Perfect. So we're going to focus a little more on your research now. So before we dive into your research, did your involvement with the ASE have an impact on your approach to economics or your general research focus?
Yeah, it definitely did. And I would say it continues to do so. So as I mentioned, the ASE's commitment to questions of ethics and human dignity and policy continue to inform and influence my research agenda. Although feminist economics is like one small sliver, I think, of social economics, as a member of the organization, I've also loved learning more about other facets of social economic research. And so being involved in this organization has, led me to pay attention to the webinar series, for example, that you ran over previous years, where I hear about work other researchers are doing on topics related to social economics. Paying attention to and attending the different plenaries and presidential lectures on a variety of topics, including like stratification economics, has also continued to like broaden my perspective of what economics is and what economists study. So that's been really great for me. It's a really broad field, and continuing to be a part of it has just like continued to like push my understanding of how economists contribute to these important questions.
Yeah, that's great. So what is your research agenda or your area of study, and really what motivates you to be involved in that particular area?
Yeah, it's a big question, and this is also I'm kind of like expanding rather than narrowing in. So my research does span a variety of topics in the social economic space. I'm broadly interested in applying a gender lens to different applied micro questions that have policy implications. But specifically, I've been researching economic considerations in intimate partner violence and violence against women since graduate school. I've also been doing some other work applying a gender lens to other types of questions. For example, looking at gender responsive budgeting or how gender norms can influence economic outcomes. But like looking back on my work on violence against women, understanding some of those economic dimensions can really help harness resources and willpower to start combating it. So I think it's important to highlight like the real world implications of such violence, just to get people to start paying attention, to devote energy, time, and money to intervention and prevention programs. I think thinking about gender, and we can talk about this more as well, can help policymakers and educators think more carefully about how different policies and procedures may have differential impacts on individuals based on their different identities, of which gender is a really important one, in which way in which we experience the world.
That's great. So I know you've already published a number of interesting articles ranging, of course, there are too many for me to list, right? But I do want to take a few minutes to really highlight some of your articles and dive a little deeper into some of the questions that you bring up in your research, if that's okay. In your feminist economics article titled "Time Heals All Wounds, a Capabilities Approach for Analyzing Intimate Partner Violence," you concentrate on the critical issues of violence against women. Can you discuss the issues surrounding intimate partner violence and how violence against women is an economic issue?
Sure. Thanks for that question. Like I said, I think highlighting some of the economic costs can motivate policymakers to pay more attention. But economists have highlighted both like economic costs and consequences and economic causes associated with violence against women, going back now for like several decades, although it's become an increasingly popular area of research for economists. So, for example, household bargaining theories shed some light on the ways in which economic resources, so employment, wages, asset ownership, can be protective or a risk factor with respect to violence by increasing a woman's bargaining power. So the way some of these traditional bargaining theories of the household hypothesize the relationship is, in theory, the more resources that a woman, and I'm saying a woman because primarily we see intimate partner violence being perpetrated by men against women, but that's not always the case, but that's just the way I'm going to talk about it today. So in theory, the more resources a woman has, the more she'll be able to like bargain for less violence. However, the empirical evidence on the topic is really mixed. Like the results we find show that that's not always the case. Like this theory doesn't always hold up in the real world. A lot of the findings seem to be conditioned in the like specific society or culture in which the research is taking place. So that's another like pitch for the importance of considering the social aspect of economics. And in some situations, we find like a backlash effect actually dominates instead of this bargaining theory. So that is, violence can be used by perpetrators to reestablish patriarchal power structures. So instead of wages or asset ownership being protective with respect to violence, it actually creates this backlash effect in which there's more violence as men partners attempt to like reestablish power. They feel threatened perhaps by the imbalance in economic resources. So again, just evidence that gender norms really matter in the translation between economic resources and violence against women, or intimate partner violence in relationships more generally.
Yeah.
So that's how economics has started to contribute to like thinking about economic causes of intimate partner violence. But the economic costs and consequences, that other side of the equation, associated with violence, are also really extensive and well documented on that end. It includes like physical and mental health costs associated with increased utilization of healthcare. That's like the direct effects or direct costs, but there's also so many indirect effects associated with experiencing violence. For example, less attention and engagement in school or work is a really significant consequence that, as you can imagine, has long-run consequences, like compounding effects. Reduced mobility is something we're finding on some research we're doing on the like effects of public space harassment on women in South Asia, is like mobility restrictions, either on the woman's side because they feel unsafe or threatened, or it's being imposed on them by family members or friends who are saying it's too dangerous for you to go outside, so we're going to restrict your capability for mobility in an attempt to like protect you, which is also like a form of control. So that's how it's an economic issue. I think regardless of what side of the coin you're looking at, economics can shed like important light on this issue.
Mm-hmm. And so from this article and others you've written, I see that you often use the capability approach in your work. So could you describe what that is and why it's important or helpful?
Sure. I think the capabilities approach is such a great illustration of how like a social economic perspective on an issue can like manifest. So the capabilities approach was developed by economist Amartya Sen and expanded upon by many others, including Martha Nussbaum and Ingrid Robbins. It's essentially a normative, non-monetary framework to evaluate well-being. So all that means is that like in this framework, we're looking at like non-monetary measures, like not GDP based or resource based measures of assessing how well you're doing. Instead, in this framework, the expansion of freedoms is really considered to be like the main end goal of development. So when we talk about freedoms in the capability approach, it is, what is an individual free to do and to be? And the language Sen uses is that of functioning. So how can we expand the various functionings that a person is actually able to do and to be in their lives? So I've talked about like the capability for mobility, the ability to like move safely between places in the world. It's not typically a lens used in this literature, like the violence against women literature. Nevertheless, I think it's really important to apply a capability approach framework because it highlights this really broad range of deprivations associated with violence against women, including how they can compound over time. So I think it just gives us extra evidence that this isn't just in the case of public space harassment of women, for example, it's not just like a joke or like something funny that happens. It has like very severe capability deprivation ramifications, like by restricting women's actual freedoms, like it restricts what they can actually do and be in their life. So it's worthwhile to study and try to prevent.
Yeah, absolutely. And your work is fascinating. And I know you transcend in a way a lot of different fields, right? The feminist economics, health, public policy, all those different things. But we also know that you conduct a lot of research and writing on teaching economics. And that's
Yeah.
exemplified by your recent publication on cooperative learning exercises in an online asynchronous economics classroom, which was published in the Journal of Economic Education. So I myself teach in an asynchronous classroom, and I find it so challenging to have student engagement, student discussions in such a setting. So can you explain what a cooperative learning exercise is and how it has impacted your online courses?
Yeah, and I think this is like so I started doing more research on teaching once I moved to a smaller university where I teach a lot. And I will say that research on pedagogy seems to fit also like within social economics, because the whole goal is to highlight the interaction between individuals and like what we're studying. And so part of that is encouraging students to pay attention to how their lived experiences and their friend groups and their own social interactions like influence economic behavior. So that seems I think there should be more research and thinking and talking about economic pedagogy, especially in the like a social economic sphere. So thank you for asking those questions. Yeah, so cooperative learning and teaching online, both those things, like we have to do a lot of, especially in this like, during the pandemic and in this post-pandemic world. I've loved incorporating cooperative learning exercises in my face-to-face classes, but I was really struggling with what that could or should look like in online and like purely asynchronous online classes. And that's because of some of the specific like elements of cooperative learning. So when I say cooperative learning, I'm following Kim Marie McGoldrick's definition. That is, it's a type of interactive small group learning that has 4 elements. It has to incorporate positive interdependence, which essentially means that each student's success depends on the success of others in their group. And there's a bunch of folks have written about this, so I won't talk about it too much here, but essentially that means that like you can only be successful if everyone else is successful. And so you're invested in other students also learning the material and completing the material. And as I mentioned, there's a variety of ways to structure and foster this positive interdependence. There should also be individual and group accountability, meaning students are individual for contributing to the group, but also the group as a whole is accountable for like delivering on their goals. The third element of cooperative learning is equal participation, which just means that all group members have the opportunity, like equal opportunity to participate in the activity. And 4 would be simultaneous interaction, that multiple students can actively participate at the same time. And so it's fairly straightforward to structure and implement this in face-to-face classes. But as you can imagine, like hitting all 4 of those elements in an online and asynchronous class is much more challenging, like for a variety of reasons, because of the students that self-select into online asynchronous classes that might prefer to work alone or work at different hours of the day can be really hard. So at first I did what many instructors do, and I imagine you might also do, is like use threaded discussion forums to encourage students to talk to one another, like the post and reply model. And I generally had fairly good success. Like students would post like really great initial posts, but then the engagement, like the replies to others in their class, that's where I saw like a lot less engagement and student to student interaction than I was getting in my face-to-face classes. So I really wanted to think about how to encourage more like frequent and thoughtful student-to-student interactions in these online asynchronous classes, because yes, like it's important. The instructor to student learning relationship is really important. But as a social economist, like I also want students to learn from one another's lived experiences in ways that they might not learn from me. So the article you mentioned is essentially just my detailing like a fairly involved, highly structured online workspace to like encourage this much more frequent and thoughtful interaction. And so you could read about it in the paper. We can maybe have a link to it in the show notes. But essentially it involved some time spent setting up the assignment. So making sure students were put in small groups, and students had to self-select into a specific role. So in order to encourage this positive interdependence, students were put into one of 3 different roles, and all 3 roles were critical for the group to be successful. So a student had to be a discussion leader, another had to be a responder. There's actually 3 responders, and then a summarizer. Once students were in their groups, they, like I assigned them to their groups and I gave them this private workspace. They had to answer a initial question online to gain access to this private group space. And that was to make sure that they were actually prepared to contribute to the group. Once they answered that question, they were able to access a group Google Doc, which was like their private group workspace. And there I had a series of questions and tasks, and students took turns working in the Google Doc. They could work at the same time, like satisfying some of the criterias of cooperative learning, but they could also go in and out throughout the week that the assignment was open, and comment on one another's questions and concerns, take turns editing a group response. And although it involved like a lot of setup on my end initially, for most groups, they did have a lot more interaction with one another, like in this remote asynchronous world. Instead of just replying once to a discussion board, they were going in and out of this Google Doc several times throughout the course of the week, reading and responding to like their peers' ideas. So I think it worked out. Student feedback was like generally pretty positive, but there was like a fairly steep learning curve and a little bit of time intensity involved in the setup. And that's something I'm happy to answer questions about via email or reading the article. The appendix includes all of the language and setup that I used to get that going.
No, that sounds great. Whenever I set up my asynchronous online course, I'm like, oh no, the dreaded discussion forum, right? Like, it's like once somebody's responded, like how many more responses can you give to the response type of thing?
Yes.
My noted tip here would be when you're sharing a Google Doc, make sure they can actually edit it and don't need to request to be editors, because I think I had a class where I got like 50 different emails when I tried to go innovative and do a Google Doc.
Yes.
So yes, learning curves, can be steep.
And being flexible also is really important. I made a lot of mistakes, and like tech mistakes as well, not just so yeah, but that's good modeling for students, like showing how we can be flexible and learn from mistakes and pivot, hopefully when things work out.
Absolutely. So we know, like, or we've seen right now that your research spans different areas, different themes, including violence against women, gender responsive budgeting, time use, which we haven't talked about, but I also know that you do time use articles or research, as well as economic pedagogy. But a unifying thread seems to be gender. So why is it so important to consider gender?
So why gender is the question. Gender influences every economic outcome we study, right? Like, especially from a social economic perspective, we can't consider economic behavior without considering the societies and cultures in which the economy is embedded, and specifically the social norms regarding gender at play. So that includes like just maybe more more benign gender norms regarding, traditional division of labor, so time use, but also like more insidious patriarchal institutions that contribute to these gendered inequalities in time use, for example, but also continue to enable and justify violence against women. So without paying attention to gender, that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Like if we just exclude it from our analyses, it doesn't mean that it's not having an effect. It just means that we're running the risk of reinforcing gendered inequalities or reproducing those gender norms. So I think it's incredibly important to consider the role of social identity. And I should say, not just gender is important to consider, but like many of our other social identities like race, ethnicity, just for some, I mean, so many others as well. All of these influence so many economic outcomes. And so just by ignoring them, like that doesn't mean they're not an issue. It just means that we may be like recreating the things we want to eradicate or reinforcing the things that are creating inequities.
Got it. So I want to kind of wrap up our discussion about research, but also bring it in, tie it in with socioeconomics. So can you discuss how an understanding of social economic contributes to a more inclusive and equitable understanding of economic behavior, and how you bring that into the classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I've touched on it, like I've danced around it a little bit. I think a social economic approach to the discipline is inherently more inclusive because, as I mentioned, it like centers our lived experiences and highlights that we're not just individual actors like making these utility maximizing decisions completely alone, but like we are friends and children or parents or colleagues. Like so much of our behavior is influenced by norms that aren't just utility maximization norms like altruism and reciprocity. And students know that and they feel that. So I think bringing that up in a classroom is really important. It also helps, like I mentioned, center their lived experiences. Yeah, it creates space for questions and methods that may be more interesting to a broader audience. For so long, economics was really just focused on questions and issues that were interesting and at the forefront for like white European men. But like I've said, like this social provisioning approach to economics means that economics is also concerned with unpaid labor or care labor. So regardless of who you are and the experiences you've had, like economics, there's an area of research for you in economics if we take this broader approach.
That's great. And so how can listeners find you or follow your research and read more?
Thank you for asking. My website, JackiStrenio.com, links to my research as well as has some teaching resources. You can also find me on the typical places like Google Scholar and ResearchGate. I post about teaching and research also on Twitter and LinkedIn, not that often, but you could find me there at Strenio.
Okay, and we'll put that all in the show notes. And so even though I could go on with this discussion, I do want to end our talk here with looking forward. So what do you envision the future of social economics looks like?
That is a good question, Iris. I mean, my hope for the future is that social economics as a concept is mainstreamed. I think all economics should be social economics, and all economic research should include like this consideration of the social dimension, social interactions as well. So widespread recognition in the discipline is my hope for the future.
That's amazing. So I again want to thank you so much for being on our webinar podcast series today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks.